Hi everybody, and welcome back to our ongoing studies for the month of July on migration stories in the book of Genesis. Now, you'll notice that I've used the strike through for our discussion line that's always on this front page, and the reason is this Wednesday we will not have a discussion at 9:30 here in the Bonhoeffer room or on Zoom. I have a memorial service that I need to be a part of that day, and I can't really find a way to do both. So we're not going to have text study discussion this week. And as a result of that, this video is going to be a little longer than the ones we've had lately. I've been trying to confine it to 30 minutes. I know I have a lot of ground to cover today, and probably will not be able to keep it within that 30-minute time frame. So prepare yourself. Feel free to stop the video and watch it in segments if you must. But we will not be having a discussion on Wednesday morning of this week. So please keep that in mind. Thank you. We are now on the problem of the oppression of women, and today we're going to fast forward a little bit. You see, we've been in chapters 12 and 13, kind of taking our time there. We're going to fast forward to chapter 21. And we're going to encounter a heartbreaking story there. But there's a lot of ground that we're skipping going from chapter 13 to 21. So I'm going to circle back and look at two chapters in particular, chapter 15 and 16, and make sure that we're staying on top of the story as it develops in those chapters before we read what happens in chapter 21. Okay, so let's start by going back to chapter 15. Walter Brueggemann, in his commentary on Genesis, says that this is probably the most important chapter in the whole Abraham series. Now, if I had read that comment or remembered that comment before I put the curriculum together for our study, perhaps we would have spent more time on chapter 15. So let's look and see what happens in this very, very key and important chapter. First of all, God comes to Abram in a vision. So this is not the first visit to Abram, won't be the last. But again, God comes to Abram and kind of renews the promise with Abram. And Abram, it has been trusting somewhat in that promise. That the years are going by. He continues not to have children with Sarai. So Abram says, may Eliezer, or even ask, will Eliezer be the one? Eliezer is a slave in Abram's household, seems to be the chief slave, and we don't yet have the Mosaic laws in place that define the law of primogeniture, where the firstborn son gets most of the wealth and then the others get some, and those laws aren't quite in place yet. There are customs very similar to that law in place. And I'm kind of curious to me that Abram doesn't assume that Lot would inherit all of his things, since Lot's his nephew, kind of an adopted son in some ways. But instead, Abram throws out the possibility that Eliezer is actually going to be the beginning of this family tree that God has been promising. So it's kind of a curious look at Abram, who's trying to trust anyway, in the promise that God has made, and at the same time looking at the alternatives, and the alternative that doesn't appear to him is that he and Sarah are ever going to have a child. So he's thinking, maybe God's going to fulfill this promise through Eliezer. And God says, no, Eliezer will not be your heir. You will have a child. You will have a child. And so God promises to Abraham an offspring. And then God takes Abram outside and says, look at the stars. If you can count them, you could count your offspring. So this is very similar to what happened last week, when God said to Abram, your offspring will be like the dust of the earth. And insofar as you can't count all the grains of sand or particles of dust on the earth, likewise, when you look at the stars, they seem innumerable. They appear eternal or infinite, and God says that's what your offspring will be like. So this is not saying we'll work it out. It's saying trust. Something's going to happen. Something's going to happen, and then you get verse 5. Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Now, in the storied context where that is, it's Abram saying, okay, it won't be Eliezer. Okay, it's going to be my own offspring. And that's a moment in and of itself. And when Abraham believes, God, who can see the heart, reckoned it to him. God accounted it toward him as righteousness. This verse has been picked up in the both the Jewish and the Christian, especially the Christian tradition. And if you've ever learned the doctrine of justification by grace through faith, this is the text, and it's repeated in Paul's writings just like this. Paul actually is making the argument that it's faith and not lineage that makes one part of the elect children of God, and so it's a very important moment in the story, because as we've said all along, the two real dramas playing out here, there are a lot of sub-dramas, are will God keep the promise, and will Abram, Sarah, and their descendants trust the promise? And there are times Abram seems to trust, and sometimes he doesn't. The conclusion in chapter 15, which much of the tradition, both Jewish and Christian, have embraced, is that yes. So this seems to be that despite all the moments of disbelief that one can see in the Abraham story, and we're going to see a significant one in the next chapter, but despite all those moments of disbelief, what this verse suggests is that in the long run, the final grade, as it were, for Abram is not whether he passed every quiz with flying colors, but that he gets an A because he believed. So this seems to be the final verdict with regard to Abram, even though the story is going to continue to unfold, and we'll have good reason to question whether Abram really believes or not. And that happens in the next chapter. Chapter 16 is the beginning of the really yucky part of this story. And it is very strongly connected to chapter 21, which is our focus today and this week. But it's the beginning of a yucky part of the story, and what we see from Abram and Sarah in this part of the story really doesn't seem to adhere to the idea that Abram believed. The story begins with Sarah being barren and recognizing her barrenness. She's been barren all these years now. And Sarah makes a deal with Abram, offering to him her slave, Hagar, as his wife. There's going to be some loose language here of, and I don't know if it's in the Hebrew or the translations, to be really, really honest with you. She's kind of a wife, she's kind of a slave wife, sometimes a concubine. I mean, it's just kind of a weird way that of trying to understand this secondary wife, as it were. But Sarah, seemingly within her rights as the matriarch of this household, as it were, offers Hagar, an Egyptian slave, to Abram in order to produce for him an offspring, because she's throwing in the towel and saying, I can't do that. So Hagar is an Egyptian slave girl. That's how she's presented in the beginning. She is later referred to as Abram's wife, but is not always treated as such, and certainly not treated as in the way that Sarah is. And so Abram and Hagar get together, and she conceives. She conceives. So now you've got the slave wife, secondary in virtually every respect, but now she's going to bear the heir for Abram. And the scriptures say that when Hagar saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. So we're still calling Sarah her mistress, not her co-equal. Hagar looks with contempt on Sarah. Now Sarah is angry and blames Abram, and she says, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarah, "Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please." All right, so let's just wrap our heads around the dynamic here. Abram does not say, "She's my wife, leave her alone." No, she's not considered in this moment his wife. He still considers her, Hagar, to be Sarah's slave girl. Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please. So, as we'll see again in chapter 21, Abram relents to what Sarah wants to do. And so the scriptures say that Sarah dealt harshly with Hagar. And she's doing this with Abram's permission. So Hagar runs away. Hagar, already pregnant, runs away because she can't deal anymore with Sarah's harsh treatment of her. And she goes out into the wilderness, and she's by a spring, and God comes and finds her. "Why are you here?" And she says, "My mistress is mistreating me," yada yada. And God tells her, "Go back to Sarah and submit to her." We're going to have to deal. We're going to have to deal with the inherent patriarchy in this story, and how God plays into it as well. So God tells Hagar to go back to Sarah, submit to her, but God also promises her that she will have a son. Nobody in this storyline seems interested in having daughters, but that she will have a son, and God names him Ishmael, which means God hears. So in the context of this first story, it seems like God hears Hagar's cry. And we'll return to that in the 21st chapter. All right, in the next chapter, chapter 17, it's another significant chapter in the Abraham saga because some really interesting things happen here. So the name Abram, this is the Hebrew spelling of it, and you'll have to read from right to left because it's in Hebrew. The name Abram, remembering that the letter B sounds more like a V or somewhere in between a B and a V sometimes. Avram was probably how it would be pronounced. It sounds very much like the name, the noun for the word father. And so it's conjecture. And this is only conjecture that it means something like exalted father or exalted ancestor, Abram. And then in this chapter, God appears to Abram again and changes his name from Abram, perhaps exalted father, to Abraham. Abraham. It's not a big difference. And that comes to mean something like father of nations. Now, these are conjectured meanings of this term. Certainly, the root of the word father is in both forms of this name. And the reason we think Abraham means father of nations is because God changes his name and says, "For I have made you the father of many nations." So the expansion of the name seems to be an expansion of Abram's identity, the father of many nations, which is going to include Isaac and his offspring, but also needs to include Ishmael and his offspring. So it's a significant moment when Abram's name is changed. And then Sarah's name is changed also, but it's mostly the spelling rather than the way we would pronounce it. We're not real sure what the initial name Sarah, if it has any meaningful significance at all. Remember, these are kind of conjectures, best guesses based on the storyline. But some Bible resources will tell you that the secondary name, now the new name, Sarah with an H, means princess. So as Abram now becomes the father of many nations, Sarah becomes a princess. And God tells Abram outright that Sarah will be the mother of the heir son. Sarah will be the mother of the heir son. So, whereas in chapter 15, Abram believed and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Chapter 16, Sarah doesn't seem to believe that she's going to mother the heir, so she gives Hagar to Abram. Abram's actions, I don't know what's in his heart or his mind, but his actions of actually receiving Hagar and having a child through her don't seem to reflect someone trusting in God to provide an heir through Sarah. But here, God is very specific. Sarah will be the mother of the heir, and not Hagar. And the reason God says this is because when God visits Abram again, changes their names and so forth, Abram says, "Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight." Ishmael's been born, and oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight. Again, it's kind of like when Abram earlier said, Eliezer will be the heir. Is that how it's going to work? Now it's like, oh, Ishmael is going to be the heir. May he live in your sight. And that's when God has to correct him and say, no. Sarah will be the one who mothers the chosen one, the heir. So it's again, Abram believed and God reckoned it to him as righteousness, but Abram's struggling with it as well and imagines initially maybe it's Eliezer, now imagining perhaps it's Ishmael, but God is pointing to Sarah. And then we get the indicator that Abram's faith is kind of curious, right? The chapter begins by noting that Abram is 99 years old, and then notes that Sarah is 90 years old. Spent 90 years now, and she's been barren for all of her years of fertility so far. And so Abraham laughs. Abraham laughs. That's not typically a sign of trust that one would laugh. But the word laugh is a really key term throughout the stories that follow. We're going to see that in just a moment. There's also a story that we're going to skip over where God visits Abraham again. And this time, when God says Sarah is going to have a child, Sarah laughs. So we have two moments here. One where Abraham has laughed, and we'll get a moment when Sarah laughs. And just hang on to that act. For the moment, though, I want to say this does not look like trust or believe. It looks like doubt, skepticism. And then also in chapter 17, this is where circumcision becomes a sign of the covenant. And God establishes circumcision in this chapter. That doesn't come into play anymore in our migration stories necessarily, but just to be mindful that that's part of the story here. Okay, so now we're going to move forward to Genesis chapter 21. Genesis 21. And we're going to be reading verses 8 through 21. So let's begin with verses 8 through 11. I should tell you, in the first 7 verses, we're not going to read it here necessarily, but that is where Sarah conceives and where she bears a son, and they name him Isaac. And the name Isaac means laughter. So we've got Abraham laughing in chapter 17. Sarah will laugh in chapter 18, I think it is. And then Isaac is born, and his name is laughter. Remember that. So in the first 7 verses, we have the story of Isaac's birth, and then Isaac gets old enough to be weaned. So I don't know what age that is. My guess would be somewhere between 2 and 3 years. Could be much later. I just don't know ancient Near East practices for weaning. And Abraham has a big feast to celebrate Isaac being weaned. Now, we're going to have a problem with math in these chapters. And it has to do with the relative ages of Ishmael and Isaac. It has to do with Ishmael's age in these stories. I think the storytellers are badly inconsistent with regard to Ishmael's age. It is noted that when Ishmael's born, Abraham is 86 years old. 86 years old. 13 years later, God tells Abraham and Sarah that within 1 year, Sarah will have a child. So 14 years after Ishmael is born, somewhere in there, Isaac is born. So conceivably, Ishmael is 14 years old when Isaac is born. And then the next story begins when Isaac is weaned. And I'm being relatively conservative at saying 2 years. It's my imagination that in most cultures, weaning happened closer to 3 or 4. But let's just say 2 years. Now, for Isaac's weaning, Ishmael's around 16 years old, maybe 17, maybe more, maybe slightly less. All right, 16 years old. So, I mean, that's a pretty strapping age at that point. But the language of the story is really inconsistent. On the one hand, he's old enough to play with Isaac. On the other hand, it sounds like Hagar carries him almost like a child. She lays him down under a bush. She has to feed him water. The story on the one hand with the math makes it sound like he could be 17 years old, and on the other hand makes him sound like he's about 17 months old. It's a weird inconsistency in the story, and we'll talk a little bit about how some of the rabbinical traditions have tried to fix that. But Sarah has a son, Isaac. He's old enough to be weaned. They have a feast, and it says that Sarah sees Ishmael playing with Isaac. Now, I have the word playing in quotations because it's a hard word to translate. It can go in a number of different ways, and almost every biblical translation that you own, that you see, that we have at our disposal, has to make a pretty deep interpretive decision of how to read this. Sarah sees Ishmael playing. The the root of that verb for playing is the same root as the word Isaac, which is the same root as the word for laughter. Okay, so there's some sense of playfulness, frivolity going on here. But playing and playfulness can be taken a number of ways. Ishmael could have been laughing. Ishmael could have been teasing. Ishmael could have been mocking. Ishmael could have been playing in the best sense of the term. Ishmael could have been making sport. There's even one form of this verb that refers to the playfulness while having sex. So it could refer to, something a little untoward, inappropriate. So I have the word playing in quotations because it's not real. We're not real sure what exactly this means, why exactly Sarah would see it, and she's incensed by it. Is it just because this is Ishmael, she hates everything about him, or is Ishmael doing something that justifies Sarah's anger? We don't know, but the translators of this story are going to show their hand if they say something like Ishmael was mocking Isaac. Now they're feeling like Ishmael, provoked what follows. When the Apostle Paul makes reference to this story in Galatians chapter 4, he is part of a rabbinical tradition that interprets that word in its strongest sense. And in fact, he makes reference to the older child persecuting the younger child. So that's kind of an interesting thing. It's a reflection of the way Paul has been trained to read Scripture himself. So I have the word playing in quotations because it can be translated in the lightest sense or the heaviest sense. It can be translated in a way that makes Sarah's anger, just unjustified or very justified. But I also have the words with Isaac in parentheses because the Hebrew manuscripts that we have at our disposal do not have those words in it. Those words apparently were added when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek. It's called the Septuagint. It was, about 100 years before Christ was born. And so it's a considerably later document than the Hebrew manuscripts. And either they added this as an editorial clarification, or perhaps they had access to a Hebrew manuscript that we don't. But in most of the older and reliable manuscripts that we have, the words with Isaac are not there. That makes a big difference, right? So what if you just say, Sarah saw Ishmael playing, and she got mad. Sarah saw Ishmael laughing, got mad. So somebody along the way, it seems, has tried to understand Sarah's anger and has thought through the possibilities of translating the word playing, and has determined that Ishmael was doing something either mockingly or inappropriate with Isaac, which would justify Sarah's anger. That just tells us that throughout the biblical tradition and the manuscript tradition, people are struggling with what exactly to do with this verb that could be translated lightly or heavily, and what exactly warrants Sarah's intense anger. One way or another, Sarah is angry at what she sees, and she says to Abraham, get rid of her and her son. That is her demand right there. So in the next few verses, we see how it is that Abraham responds. And the writers are quick to say that Abraham's very distressed. He whether he feels affection for Hagar or not, it's really hard to say. He does seem to have some affection for Ishmael. Ishmael is his oldest son. And even though the law of Moses is not in place yet, most of the customs of that time would say that Ishmael actually has some right to the inheritance, a greater right than Isaac. And one thing that Sarah says in demanding that Abram get rid of him is that he will not have the inheritance that belongs to Isaac. So Sarah is already thinking ahead about what life is going to be like after Abraham is gone. So Abraham's distressed over this. He's not in favor of it, but he also relents. So here's a reality we have to deal with. This story is, without a doubt, written in a very patriarchal context through very patriarchal eyes with very patriarchal language and approaches to everything. But women are not without some power. And even though I imagine almost every person doing the writing in the manuscript history is male, women are not without power. There's one Old Testament scholar who feels like some of these stories actually, in their oral tradition, were matriarchal stories, and then the men took them and reshaped them. It's kind of hard to build that argument with a lot of concrete confidence, but it certainly makes some degree of sense. At least the story is letting us know that a woman like Sarah has influence with Abraham. And Abraham relents. And so again, this chapter 21 is very much like what we saw back in chapter 16, when Hagar conceived and looked on Sarah with contempt, and Sarah hated that and complained to Abraham about it, and wanted God to judge between the two of them whose fault it was. I think it was hers, but God wanted God to judge between them whose fault it was, and Abram said, no, you can do with her as you please. So this is the second time Abraham has relented to Sarah's anger, as it were. And Abraham's distressed, and God consoles Abraham. But in the end, God relents also and allows Abraham to send Hagar away, as Sarah has demanded. So, just like this is a patriarchal context, it's also a hierarchical context. And yet, even within that hierarchy, there are times that God will relent to what humans want, even if it's not necessarily God's own will. I don't know how we square that with theology perfectly, but in the event of something like building the temple, it's not apparent that God wanted the people to build a temple. God allowed the people to build a temple because they wanted to. In the event of Israel getting a king in their history, it is very evident that God did not want them to have a king. They were better served by having God-appointed judges, and yet Israel insisted on having a king because all the other nations were going to have a king, and God said, look, you want a king, you're going to get a king. You'll have a king, but you'll have to put up with kings because kings are hard to deal with, and that proved to be incredibly true. So it's a curious thing that God will relent periodically throughout these stories as well. And then God tells Moses that Isaac is the rightful heir. So even according to the custom, Ishmael should be the rightful heir. He's the firstborn son. And those customs don't usually differ between the first wife and the second wife and so forth. It usually has to do with the male seed. But this is the beginning of something that we're going to see throughout the story, where the latter son will be chosen over the earlier son, the lesser son chosen over the greater son. And this is what Walter Brueggemann and others call the law of inversion. We're gonna see it with Isaac's children. Isaac is going to have twins, and the firstborn is Esau. But the son that becomes the son of promise and the heir, the one who gets the blessing, is Jacob, the secondborn. And then Jacob's going to have 12 sons, but really it's Joseph, the 11th of those sons, that becomes the most prominent one among them. So we see throughout these stories that God often chooses the lesser over the greater. And that's a big deal. It's going to be a big deal theologically throughout the scriptures. And it's already happening here. Isaac will be the rightful heir according to God, even though Ishmael is the firstborn son. So then the question becomes, what to do with Ishmael? If this were a medieval kingdom and a king had two sons and wanted the second son to become the next king, they would kill the first son. Or they'd send him into exile on some deserted island, or they'd lock him in the tower, or something to get rid of him. Because as long as he's alive, he remains a threat, both legally or custom-wise, or perhaps even physically a threat, because he will have been subverted by the younger one. So the question is, if Isaac's going to be the heir, what do we do with Ishmael? And I think Abraham and God have two different ideas working here. I think Abraham thinks it's time for Ishmael to die. And we'll see that as the story progresses. But God promises good for Ishmael. And God accepts that Ishmael, by virtue of being a son of Abraham, will also become a nation. So we'll see more about that in a moment. But at least at this moment, God tells Abraham that Ishmael will also be a father of a nation. So then Abraham packs a lunch for Sarah and Ishmael, sends them off into the desert. Now, that's language of packing a lunch. It's a little snarky, and I felt badly about it until I ran across the same phrase in Sib Towner's commentary on Genesis. So it didn't start with me, and I think the snarkiness is well deserved. Abraham basically gives Hagar and Ishmael a skin of water. And it says that Hagar put it on her shoulder along with the child. I don't know exactly what that means. Sounds like she's carrying Ishmael. And again, he could be 17 by now, but it's almost like in this story they have infantilized him and made him a baby again. So she's got the water on one arm, the baby on the other, and they're sent out into the desert. They're probably going to die, right? The desert known for being a place that's harsh and drying people up, right? You die in the desert, and a skin of water will perhaps get you far enough away to where nobody here has to see you die and feel bad about it. But it's not enough to survive. And I cannot help but feel like this is an incredibly cruel demand by Sarah, an incredibly cruel relenting by Abraham, and perhaps by God, although God's going to come through in this story. So now, we get verses 15 through 19, and we see the encounter between God and Hagar. So again, Ishmael, although math-wise he could be 17 or older, he's presented kind of like a child in this story. The only voice he has is perhaps crying. And Hagar leaves him to die. Okay? She leaves him to die. She puts him under one of the bushes, and then she goes away. Now, this is probably one of the most heart-wrenching moments in this story and in many stories. He's going to die, and his mother can't bear to see it. And the only recourse she can come up with there in the desert is to place him under a bush, which would perhaps, if not shield him from her vision, and to walk away so that when he dies, she doesn't have to see it. That's where we are in the story, and that's why I think this is an incredibly difficult story to hear in terms of Abraham, Sarah, and perhaps even as the Word of God. Then it says that God hears Ishmael cry. God has heard Ishmael's cry. Remember that the name Ishmael means God hears. When God hears Ishmael, God makes a promise to Hagar, and it's very much like what we saw in chapter 16. So back in chapter 16, God said to the pregnant Hagar, "Now you have conceived, shall bear a son, you shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction." Remember, God hears. "He will be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. He shall live at odds with all of his kin." And in this chapter, God says, "I will make him a great nation." So, again, God says, "I will make a great nation of him." So what we have is that Ishmael is not going to die out there in the desert. In fact, he's going to grow up, and he's going to become the father of a great nation. And we'll see a little bit more about that in a minute. And then God provides for them a well, where they thought they were out in the middle of nowhere with no resources to water. Abraham's skin of water that he packed for them is run dry quite some time ago. Now God provides for them a well, which means you can live here. You can live here. And that's the beginning of the rescue for Hagar and Ishmael. So the rest of our reading then, verses 20 through 21, is about how Ishmael grows up. It says that God was with the boy. I just want you to know how difficult it might be for the Jewish tradition, both in the oral tradition and then in the written tradition, to acknowledge this. God was with the boy. Because Ishmael is actually going to become a type and a figure for a lot of people that Israelites did not consider friends. Ishmael is described as being in the wilderness, particularly the wilderness of Paran, and he was an expert with the bow, so he's an archer, which puts him in pretty good stead, both in terms of security, military strength, but also in terms of hunting and things like that. And then, not nice of me to put it this way perhaps, Mommy got him an Egyptian wife. Remember, Hagar was Egyptian, and so she probably sent back to her family to find a wife for Ishmael. But it just sounds like another one of those infantilizing things where Hagar does for Ishmael what it seems like Ishmael could have done on his own. So now you have Ishmael, and he's also the father of a nation. He's also blessed. He also has God's protection. And then you have Isaac. So it seems to me that the writers and all of the interpreters ever since, in the Jewish tradition, in the Islamic tradition, in the Christian tradition, both biblical scholars and theologians really have to reckon with what to do when you have two kind of competing claims to being the offspring of Abraham and the father of a great nation. So I think the ambiguity that we see in our story of the writers toward Ishmael is clear. On the one hand, Sarah gets to treat Hagar horribly, and Abraham relents. And in the last story, at least until God saves them at the last minute, it would appear that God relents. Certainly in the first story, God tells Hagar to go back to her abusive mistress. So I think there's ambiguity there because on the one hand, you've got the sheer mistreatment of Hagar and of Ishmael. But then, on the other hand, you've got something marvelous being said about Ishmael. God will protect him. He'll be the father of a great nation. He's a child of Abraham. All of these things are signifying great things about Ishmael that most people would only dream of having said about them back in this day. So it's really interesting ambiguity going on there. But throughout history, many people in the Jewish tradition have had trouble kind of reckoning with Ishmael. I'll give you an example. The name Ishmael means God hears. There is a rabbinical tradition that says anytime people oppress Israelites, God hears their cry and responds to them. And so they're taking the name Ishmael and kind of turning it on its head to say that the descendants of Ishmael oppress the descendants of Isaac, and when they do, God hears the descendants of Isaac. Now that's a curious nationalistic twist on the plain reading of that God hears Hagar's cry. God hears Ishmael crying out from under the bush. It's kind of been flipped on its head to where now it means God hears the Israelites when the Ishmaelites oppress them. So that's what I'm saying. It's like in the tradition, Ishmael's legacy has not always been treated, even with the degree of ambiguity that the Old Testament writers give it. It's almost been like completely flipped upside down. Now, if you think this is a bad Jewish habit, let me assure you that Christians have been just as bad. That in the Christian tradition, many times the treatment of Hagar and God allowing Sarah to treat Hagar the way she did has been used as a justification for slavery. In fact, Robert Louis Dabney, who was part of the seminary that I attended, but back a century earlier, he once famously argued that because God told Hagar to go back to Sarah and submit to her, that people had the right to capture runaway slaves and return them to their master. This was a Presbyterian theologian speaking out of this story, justifying that kind of activity towards slaves. So it's not just the Jewish tradition that has kind of turned the meaning of this story into their own favor. Now, the Quran mentions Ishmael as well and treats Ishmael as a prophet. I am by no means very familiar with the Quran and by no means a great interpreter of it or representative of it. I can tell you what I have read about it more, and that is that in the Quran, Ishmael is represented kind of as a prophet, as it were, and a prototype of faithfulness. He's a prophet that converts many heathens to the true God, so he's a worshiper of the true God, and leads other people to be the same. He's mentioned 8 times in the Quran, and usually it's in a list of famous people, but there are no real stories about Ishmael in the Quran itself. Now, in the Islamic tradition, there are stories about Ishmael. One of the writings in post-Quranic writings in Islam, says that it was actually Ishmael and not Isaac whom Abraham takes out in Genesis chapter 22 and prepares to sacrifice at God's command. That's a really, really, really difficult chapter to interpret. But in this Islamic writing, not the Quran itself, it's actually Ishmael. And in fact, when you read it there, it kind of makes a little more sense that Abraham's willing to do this, to sacrifice Ishmael for the sake of Isaac. And God doesn't let him. In one of the other Islamic post-Quranic texts, Abraham doesn't just send Hagar and Isaac off with a water skin into the desert. He actually goes with them as far as Mecca. And so there developed a tradition that one would either walk or run between these two mountains in order to reenact Hagar's trail with Ishmael. And there's also a well there, the Amzar, that is believed to be the well from which Hagar and Ishmael drank. So, that we have the bare bones of a story that was in some kind of oral tradition. It comes to us with a considerable amount of confusion, to be honest. That's the reason I keep talking and harping about Ishmael's age. And a considerable amount of ambiguity of what to do with actually the firstborn son, but not perhaps the legitimate firstborn son, to Hagar, who's sort of a wife, but sort of still a slave. Hagar comes across really as a victim in most of this story. She is blamed for having looked on Sarah with contempt in chapter 16. But a lot of art represents her as being this kind of beautiful Egyptian that's really put upon because of Sarah's harshness. Sarah does not come across well at all in these stories. And in my opinion, neither does Abraham. He relents to Sarah a lot in ways that I find particularly unattractive. But again, it's not the purpose of these stories for me to like or not like Abraham. So all of that is just to say that we have this story. It's filled with ambiguity. It's filled with inconsistencies. And yet it's a significant story in the history of salvation, as it were. Christian theologians have not always known what to do with it well, starting with the New Testament. Jewish theologians, Islamic theologians have not always known precisely what to do with it, but everybody's trying to recognize the significance of it and the meaningfulness of it. I'm sorry then that we will not be able to discuss this further on Wednesday, but once again remember that this Wednesday we are not having our discussion either here in the Bonhoeffer room or on Zoom, because I will be preoccupied with a memorial service. So we'll pick this up again in worship this weekend, and I hope to see you there. Thanks.